Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Steve Sang. I am the director of the SOAS China Institute. Welcome to our first webinar for the year 2026. I'm delighted for this webinar to introduce to you an excellent speaker, Professor Timothy Cheek. Professor Cheek holds the Louis Cha Chair in Chinese Research at the Institute of Asian Research in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and at the Department of History at the University of British Columbia in beautiful Vancouver. He is also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His works primarily focus on the role of Chinese intellectuals in the 20th century and the history of the Chinese Communist Party. He has published very widely, including 5 books that I personally know of. The first one was The Secret Speeches of Chairman Mao, which came out in 1989, followed by Propaganda and Culture in Mao's China in 1997, and New Perspectives on State Socialism in China, also out in the same year. More recently, it was Mao Zedong and China's Revolution, which came out in 2002. And most recently, the Chinese Communist Party, A Century in 10 Lives, which came out in 2021. Before I bring it to the webinar and the subject, I would also like to flag up one of his other recent publications, which is an article, Xi Jinping's Counter-Reformation, which came out in the Journal of Contemporary China in 2021. So you can see that he is extremely well placed to talk to us on the subject of what do we need to know about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, before I hand over to Professor Cheek, let me remind you participants that that he will be taking questions and he will be answering them. And if you could use the Q&A function for that, I will be grateful. Obviously, you are free to ask whatever questions you like to ask. But if you would like to keep your identity anonymous, you have the options of doing so. You just need to make it very clear to me that you are doing so. But otherwise, please provide information about who you are. If you provide that in your Q&A box, I will not read out any information that will reveal your identity. But it will help me to moderate and pick questions from people who sometimes are not particularly have ready access to Chinese studies expertise or some of our other criteria that we normally use for picking questions. Now, with that, let me hand over to Professor Timothy Cheek. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Steve. And my thanks to you and to the China Institute at SOAS for giving me this opportunity to talk with you about this topic today. And I very much look forward to, and I want to leave time for questions and discussion. With the kind of audience that SOAS attracts, there's mostly fellow specialists, so no doubt amongst those of you with us today will know more about certain aspects of what I talk about than I do, and I would be happy to hear from you. So with that said, I'm trusting that you can see the opening slide with the title, What Do We Need to Know About the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, topic that Steve and I hit upon as we prepared for this event. And so Most of us, most scholars of modern China, have the opportunity to speak to the public or to offer advice on China or China training to their respective governments. For the past 2 decades, I have done just that in Canada. The benefit for me has been from engaging senior civil servants in Canada, has been to learn what of my scholarship is of use to public policy. This comes down to the question for today, most often, what do we need to know about the CCP? Social sciences handle this question particularly well, but today I would be suggesting what history can offer. So the first thing to remember, and we need not be literature professors to encourage us all into a bit of reflexivity, that is to say, to just step back and say, what is your image, what is my image of the CCP? And of course, a very strong influence is media images, whether those are Chinese media or media in various countries around the world. And of course, whatever textbooks we've read and materials we've looked at. But I think the key point here is that we are, to name the elephant in the room, relations between most Western countries, certainly the UK, Canada, Australia, even the United States, going through whatever it's going through, the general media image of China is negative. And certainly, activities of the Chinese government, run by the CCP, have given plenty of reasons for people to have some doubts or some concerns. But you know, and those of you who are familiar with my work know that I try to stay away from the two extremes. The two extremes being China is all bad, and the other extreme, China is all good. And so it is nonetheless helpful to keep in mind what the media image is in your head. And I call you, brothers and sisters, to take a moment to reflect and to be honest with yourself about what is your basic image of the CCP. Do you find Frank Decoder convincing? Do you find Rebecca Carl convincing? There you go. Do you find Zheng Yongnian convincing? So for myself, as I've been doing my work, as Steve has outlined, I've worked on party history and Mao for a number of years. But at the same time, I've been working on intellectuals. And so my entire career is around trying to figure out the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and intellectuals, particularly party intellectuals or intellectuals who chose to engage the party directly, and what that tells us about modern Chinese history. A bit of biography and also reflexivity, if you like. I started my studies of modern China in 1973 at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. And 2 books I read then were American books, although I was in Australia. And they have both shaped my approach, but they've given me the fundamental questions of my research and have left me with an enduring challenge. One was a book by Mark Selden called The Yan'an Way, which is still worth reading, which gave a very well documentarily grounded account of the Yan'an rectification and the production and other campaigns associated with it. And it was written in the late 60s, and it was generally positive. It was saying that this revolution was a good revolution, and look at all the good things it did. The other book was by Merle Goldman, called Literary Dissent in Communist China. The subtitle of Selden's book was The Yan'an Way in Revolutionary China. So you got the signal in the titles, Revolutionary China and Communist China. Merle Goldman documented equally well the terrible repression of intellectuals under the Communist Party. And so for the rest of my career, I've been trying to square that circle about the actual achievements, which I think are real, of the Chinese Communist Party, and the sins, transgressions, and disasters at the hands of the Communist Party, also real. And so in recent years, I've been turning to the question of what is Dang, and what can history show us about this thing called Dang? And of course, Dang is Gongchang-Dang. It's the Communist Party. And we all know, those of us who have been reading a little bit about China know that the word party in English is a translation of Dang. But we know it's not a normal political party, normal being the Western model of a public political organization competing for legitimate political authority in an open field of competition, usually by free and fair elections and moderated by an independent judiciary. And so that's not China. That's not the Communist Party. That's also was not the CPSU, the Communist Party in Russia, and of course, other state socialist countries. So what is it? I'm going to suggest three perspectives from history that might help us be added to social science analyses. But here's a tentative answer, and I invite criticism of it. It is not a political party. It is a salvationary political institution that governs, transforms, and protects while demanding obedience and gratitude. And that is both too long, it's not a term, and I am in search of a word, a better translation of Dang than party, and I would be open to your suggestions. Right. So we know about the Chinese Communist Party today. Here we have the meeting of the Congress of I think it's the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, and of course the related National People's Congress. And it goes from top, Xi Jinping, to the bottom with that unfortunate salute they have selected for saying your pledge to the Communist Party. And so this is the obvious thing, which is at first we realize the Communist Party both leads China and penetrates society down to the local level, not simply, not monolithically, but powerfully and importantly. So scholarly images of Dang. The scholars have been wondering about this for a long time, and I just take a half dozen selection. You will know of others. But the metaphor of the Catholic Church, Ken Jowett, and you will see that although I'm a historian, I do stray into the fields of politics, political science, political theory, literature, and even a little sociology and the occasional bit of anthropology. And in fact, one of my themes is the necessity for interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary study of China. So the metaphor of the Catholic Church beginning in the 1970s, his first monograph was 1978 on the Leninist response to national dependency. Ken Jowett, a political theorist at the University of California, Berkeley, continued to use the Catholic Church as a metaphor. And as Steve mentioned, one of my more recent articles is the Counter-Reformation, Xi Jinping's Counter-Reformation. So I absolutely tip my hat to Ken Jowett. And I was talking about it with Liz Perry, and Liz Perry said, I realized so much in my life, whenever I think I have a good idea, I realize Liz Perry published an article on it 5 years before. So I was talking with Liz, who I know, and we're doing some work with, and she said, oh, we got the Catholic Church metaphor from Ken. And so that's something to think about. For me, the value of the Catholic Church metaphor, I particularly am thinking of the early modern period when the church had an army and also inquisitional rights to burn people at the stake. I leave assessments of contemporary Catholicism to the Catholics. But it's a useful metaphor because it de-orientalizes China to some degree. It finds something that's familiar to people who are imbued with the Western view of things, history, and so that's useful. Lowell Dittmer, in his book from the 1980s, which I thought was a very good summation of his work, just stressed something that once he said it, it was, this is a sign of a good idea. Once it's said, you go like, well, that's obvious, except that I never thought of it until you said it. He just reminded us of the salvationary mission of the Chinese Communist Party. Likewise, these are all older generation scholars. Donald Monroe, a great scholar of Chinese philosophy, pre-modern philosophy, wrote a series of 3 wonderful books. The Concept of Man, he was writing in his time and place in ancient China, was it medieval China and modern China? Sort of Confucius, Zhu Xi, and Mao. And his last book, or one of his later books in '93, was The Imperial Style of Inquiry, which I think gives a very intelligent analysis of what he considers Confucian totalism, its strengths and its weaknesses, which is certainly informed my idea of ideological governance, which we will get to shortly. More recently, there's 3 different views. Organizational Emperor, from Zhang Yongnian's book of 2009. Cadre Nation, an excellent article that John Fitzgerald did 4 or 5 years ago, and the book with a lurid pink cover that goes under the name of Cadre Country. And then The Party Family that Kimberly Manning has suggested in a very valuable new study, which is looking at the gender aspect of the party. Fitzgerald is really talking at the sort of oligarchic or aristocratic elite that has emerged so it's a bit of a sociological look at the nature and operation of the Chinese Communist Party. And Zhang Yongnian is really trying to understand, and in his more recent book from 2019, is really trying to understand Chinese statecraft in depth. I'm in part of a project with Bruce Rusk and Yin Shoufu on looking at Chinese statecraft from the late Ming from early Ming to Xi Jinping, essays that we collected from a Festschrift seminar we held for Timothy Brook when he retired from UBC, and that will come out next year. Now, you will see on the right-hand side, Yidang Zhiguo, so this is a reminder that the idea of the party state, which I think is fairly broad in political science language, the Dangguo, of course, was first applied to the Kuomintang, and so it comes along as an overlap there. So, what I'm going to suggest, and by reviewing the half dozen different views, is my suggestion is that I am only contributing to an ongoing conversation. The proverbial Paodran Yu Yin, whatever, to toss out a brick to get jade. So aspects of the history of the CCP that can help us understand its working and policies, and may help us find more effective ways to engage China. That's the big so what in the policy engagement work that I've been doing. The senior civil servants want to know, what do we need to know to be more effective in our engagement with China? Not to make China happy or unhappy, but in Canada's case, our prime minister is going to China this week. What do we need to know in order to engage with China more productively for Canada, and both avoiding trouble and getting some of what we want? And so there's many things we could look at, but I am suggesting 3. Ideological governance in a pedagogical state, which helps us to understand the miscommunication in political discourse between Canada and the West and China, which is that fundamentally the political language in China is around values, and most fundamentally in the West about the moderation of interests. Second, diversity within the party over time, which reminds us of the power of contingency, that things don't have to be the way they are. They didn't have to become the way they are, and which suggests some flexibility in the future. And the fundamental pragmatism of the Chinese Communist Party that has been highly successful, to wit, it still exists, and the CPSU does not. And finally, lessons of history for party leaders, for various Chinese, and for us. So keeping a diversity of lessons to be learned. All right. So the first item is the ideological governance in Xi Jinping on the party. So what is ideological governance? Well, first of all, what's the deal with ideology? Let's look, let's start by reading the current font of wisdom. Party and government, soldiers and civilians, and schools, east, west, north, south, and middle. The party leads them all. It's precisely because we've always adhered to the centralized and unified leadership of the party that we can achieve a great historical turning point and start a new period of reform and opening up, a new journey of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. To do this, to uphold the party's leadership, which is a major principle that determines the future and the destiny of the party and the country, the entire party and the whole country must, without any wavering, maintain a high degree of ideological consciousness, political consciousness, and consciousness of action. What's the deal with consciousness? So this is my take. This is my formulation of what I've learned over the years. But I give you the quote from 2018 from Xi Jinping as a suggestion that I may not be completely off the mark. And we will see in Chinese it says 教化治理, and we'll talk about 教化 in a moment. Ideological governance asserts a role for the government as a pedagogical state that has the responsibility to provide order and prosperity through civilizing its citizens according to the superior insights of certified transformational bureaucrats, learned in a body of thought that, when applied properly, will bring great harmony to all under its sway, and which therefore requires and deserves freedom from competition from alternative and presumably lesser forms of political activity. So for me, I'm interested in why is 思想, thought, ideology, 意识形态, why is that so central? And so 教化, for those of you with a good Confucian background, know that this is not a new term. So ideological governance and 教化. Happily, a lot of what I want to say, and would take hours and hours to try to present some materials, have been covered by my colleague at the University of Sydney, Guo Yingjie, who edited, I think, an excellent volume on 教化, Chinese ideas and practices of moral transformation. So 教化 is transformational moral education through exemplars, etc. In the volume that we're doing on statecraft from early Ming to Xi Jinping, my chapter is on actually the community compacts, the Xiangyue, since the Song period, because I was very interested in their similarity and differences to rectification, thought reform, and 学习小组 in the party. But what at the core of that is a fundamental faith in Chinese political thought and statecraft practice of 教化, of the moral cultivation for good governance. And this is for cadre training in the 20th century. Liu Shaoqi famously on the cultivation of the Communist Party member and guiding the people, Liang Shuoming and the mass education movement. And so the pictures we have here, we have Xi Jinping. I think he's making one with the masses there, but we have pictures of him sitting with Central Committee Politburo members having a study session. So can you imagine in Whitehall or in Washington, the executive leaders sitting down and having a study session on good thought? So that's something about Chinese politics. And of course, we've got, something from Yunnan, and there are our Shanxi farmers waving a poster of an early poster of Chairman Mao from the 1940s. And the rural modern, Kate Merkel-Hess's excellent book on the Liang Shuoming and others, Yan Yangshu, James Yen and others, on guiding the people. Under the Communist Party, of course, it's always been mobilizing the people. But now under Xi Jinping, I don't think he's so interested to mobilize people as to guide them to proper behavior. So this 教化 has a deep cultural and administrative history. One tidbit of data, it says the Confucian ideological governance under the Ming state. Wang Yangming's Nangan Community Compact, Nangan Xiangyue, 1517. In the long story of the Xiangyue, it was where the state took control of what had formerly been local Confucian autonomous organization of the Confucian study sessions. And Liu Kun, who was a senior regional official in the late Ming, 1599, he has his Xiangbao Tiaoyue, the Community Security Compact, meaning combining the Xiangyue and the Baojia. And you look at this thing here, the tablet that's up there, the big one with the Shengyu, right? Those are the sacred edicts from the Ming Emperor. And you can see that they are to be filial and respectful and help each other out and teach your kids well, teach your children well. Don't do bad things. Okay, so then there's these registers on the table of good deeds, bad deeds, and membership and stuff, and then the people all around it. What's the point of this? This is an official government moral training session that is supposed to happen in every village. That didn't always, but that was the idea. Okay, and the Sacred Edict standard form that he have fabulously combines moral ethics and your land ownership and how many kids in your family, basic census information. So this conflation of the administrative and the moral. So in the 20th century, the spirit of Jiaohua, the two obvious cases are Three People's Principles, whoops, bad typing on my part, of Sun Yat-sen, the Sanmin Zhuyi, and the Zhengfeng Yundong, the rectification campaign, Zhengfeng Wenxian, led by Mao, but of course with powerful contributions by Liu Shaoqi, Chen Yun, and others. Okay, so the point of this is that this ideological governance has a depth and a range. We could also talk, as we did, we had the example from the Kuomintang earlier, on the Yinang Zhiguo. Sun Yat-sen is the one you would put in the middle for that. So we can go into details on that, but I want to give us at least a broad overview. The spirit of Jiaohua, too, is down to today. Xi Jinping's road to rejuvenation. There he is, training the Politburo Standing Committee to improve themselves. But and there is the sacred edicts and the registers that you just saw from the Ming Dynasty, from Liu Kun. But then here we have a poster from the recently from the Chinese Communist Party, signed by Xi Jinping, 社会主义核心价值观, right? And then on the left, the Civility Practice Center for the New Era. These have popped up in the past 5 years or more. This one's in Zhejiang. A student of mine was there and said, hey, look, there you go. So the point being, this ideological governance, or stuff that looks like it, is happening. And the key takeaway is that this is neither new nor purely Chinese, communist. So yes, it's communist, but it also has deeper social, cultural roots. So the second theme I wanted to touch on is diversity within the party and over time. And significantly different versions of governance within the party historically we can track, existed. And drastic changes in policy have occurred in response to facts on the ground. And in fact, this is a feature, not a bug, of the Chinese Communist Party, because its turnarounds have been huge. We can think of to talk first about the chronological turnarounds. Mao's take on who is the revolutionary class in the late 1920s. He moved from the orthodox proletariat, the industrial working class, to the peasants, the farmers. It was pragmatic. Facts on the ground, there were not enough workers to get anything done. But there were no shortage of peasants, right? The fight over the move to the signification of Marxism in the 1940s, the reject the acceptance of the Soviet model in the late 40s and early 50s, then the rejection of the strict Soviet model of planned economy, a strong modification of it under the Great Leap Forward, and then in the Cultural Revolution, then turning around and dumping that in order to give, and in view of the problems of late socialism in the 1980s and China's conditions, Deng Xiaoping saying, people have to get rich, people have to get better. We can't just, they learned that having Bob Dylan and blue jeans was a real cultural problem for the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. And so there you go. And now Xi Jinping's own change away from the downsides of opening and reform. But if we look at the actual history of the Chinese Communist Party, and you can see in the background is the volume that Hans van der Ven and Klaus Mühlhahn and I pulled together with chapters by a bunch of different people. I'm very proud of this volume because we have excellent people, including two mainland China-based scholars, Zhang Jishun and Xu Jilin in the volume, taking different chapters. What we see is Sun Yat-sen's Xunzheng is actually the archetypical model for the 20th century version of ideological governance. I joke with my students and say, everything I blame Mao for, I blame Mao for, I discover Sun Yat-sen set it up first. One party, one ideology, one leader. It's, John Fitzgerald's wonderful 1990s book, Huanqing Zhongguo, Awakening China, is an excellent study that everybody who wants to understand the Communist Party should read. It's about the Kuomintang in the 1920s. So the pedagogical state. The Bolshevik party state comes in, and but that Wang Ming's vision versus Mao's policies could have gone different ways. Wang Ming would have stayed much closer to Stalin and the Soviet, would have made China different. It would not have had the scientification of Marxism the way that Mao wanted. At the same time, in the 40s, there was a cosmopolitan communism that was much less, more Marxist and less Leninist, you might say. Wang Shiwei is a famous case in Yan'an. He spoke up and got nailed in the Yan'an rectification campaign, but he was just a representative. The important thing about Wang Shiwei is he was not a democratic dissident. He was a Marxist theorist, translator of Lenin's and Trotsky's works, he was debating Mao on how to be a good communist. So they were historically a different version of people saying, how is it to be a good communist? Mao's Chelyabinsk campaign versus party ideological management. We all know that the Cultural Revolution image of the two-line struggle between Mao and Liu Shaoqi was doctored up, but it's not irrelevant. Its error was to reify the tension between charismatic leadership and rational bureaucratic leadership within the Communist Party. Those tensions we can track. That's what I tracked in the Deng Tuo biography, Propaganda and Culture in Mao's China. But Liu Shaoqi and Mao moved around. There were times when Mao was particularly management-oriented and 10 Great Relationships, his essays in 1956. And Liu Shaoqi was much more ideological. As we all know, Robert McFarlane reminded us, Liu Shaoqi was the chief implementer of the Great Leap Forward. Okay, and then in the 80s, Zhao Ziyang's pragmatic congregation, and now Xi Jinping's new fundamentalist community overturning that pragmatic approach that I think that Jiang Zemin carried on from Zhao Ziyang. So the point is that contingency and pragmatism. And so what do we need to know about the Chinese Communist Party? There have been different versions of communism by leading communists over the last century. So it's likely to continue, this range of different opinions. Suzanne Weigland-Schwarzig's wonderful chapter in this volume we're doing on statecraft, she looks at debates about Xinjiang policy. And so even under Xi Jinping, and we think there's a time when there's not going to be any kind of free debate, there's a big debate about Chinese ethnic policy, 1.0 and 2.0. And then finally, drastic response to facts on the ground. This is the fundamental item I end up pointing out to my colleagues in the civil service, which is You cannot convince China of a single thing. You can't tell China it ought to do this and it ought to do that. But you can work with other countries, liberal countries or countries that we get along with, to help shape facts on the ground that will encourage everybody to do something more positive. So finally, the lessons from history. So for the CCP, these are for those of you who study the Communist Party, this is nothing new, but this is news to the people when I try to talk to the public. So for the inter-party, unity, civilization, and strength must have leadership unity. The current leadership, and the materials I've read, when they look at the problems in China, Chinese Communist Party in Yan'an before 1942, in the mid-60s, before the Cultural Revolution, and before Tiananmen in 1989, was leadership division. And so, as Joseph Turigian has been pointing out in his study of Xi's father, Xi Zhongchun, the party, comes first. That I can understand why some party leaders would say, well, maybe I don't like the current leader or this stuff about a new personality cult, but it's better to have unity than disunity. That's my understanding of lessons that the party is taking itself. The civilization, the salvationary mode is still there. That's the justification for why they get their perquisites. And strength, they have to be strong because the world is unfair and has been unfair to them in the past. Looking outward, the West is powerful, dangerous, useful, and cannot be trusted. The people are not ready to participate in politics, so they need more Jiaoshun. And Xi Jinping is the only one who can, only the party can save China, and Xi Jinping and his team believe that only Xi can save the party. A real open question is whether, for a number of senior party people, it would really matter if it was Xi or anyone else. There just has to be someone, which we know from the orthodox, traditional Chinese thought, political thought. That's the idea of the empty axle, that doesn't matter who the emperor is as long as there is one. So lessons of history for various Chinese, that could be an entire talk by itself. But you could just, using these images from very critical scholarship like Qin Hui's, the one on coming out of the emperor system or dictatorial system, the newest book by Xu Jilin on Chinese intellectuals in the Republican period, in different waves, trying to figure out what's good for China. Up on the top left, Yang Kui-sung's social history in the Mao period of superfluous people. In other words, the people who got knocked down as rightists or otherwise purged. But two versions of popular things. There's a gentleman with his Mao badge collection. There's a nostalgia. But the nostalgia is not all good, despite the revolutionary look of Remembrance. GE, those of you who have read a bit of it, or Ian Johnson's book, know that it's actually very critical, you might say, communicative memory of Zhiqing, of particularly of the educated youth. And then up top is Guo Yuhua, a very brave sociologist who, to my utter amazement, also supports Trump. I hope someone can explain that to me one day. But this shows a range of different meanings and lessons of history, of modern Chinese history, amongst Chinese in China. And it's only a taste. Lessons of history for us. The three lenses of ideological governance, inter-party diversity, and attention to lessons actors gives us some helpful ways to understand the CCP today. Ideological governance is the fundamental approach to governance. It's the language of politics in China, exemplifying values. While in the West, political theory and practice is built around managing interests. To communicate effectively, we need to translate between these two political discourses. Often I find that the Chinese foreign ministry and the Western governments speak to cross purposes. And one of the fundamental things is that For us, the managing of interest is around the mechanisms of elections and judiciary independence. Exemplifying values in the Chinese system brings different institutional approaches to things. We don't have to agree. We don't have to do the same thing, but we sure need to understand where each of us is coming from a little more fully in order to communicate effectively. The second one, inter-party diversity, shows the contingency of history. The party development is not preordained in the past or future, and a range of ideas, interests, and policies inside the party existed in the past, exist at present, and should be anticipated in the future. So how China is governed today under Xi Jinping is not just, the other part is just not communist or a result of tragic and violent 20th century, but a new branch of the Jiaohua tree of Chinese statecraft. It's not simply old wine in a new bottle. It is a synthesis of old and new. But we need to have an articulated, empirically based understanding of the traditional aspects as well as the 20th century aspects. And then I didn't put it on the slide, but the other part of it is the pragmatism that if you're going to get something, if there's a way to move China, it is not by telling it it's not doing what we want, but by doing the best we can to create facts on the ground that would produce good behavior on both sides. So finally, as a wrap up, as we conclude this, I want to say a fourth thing, which is not what we know, but how we know. And I have come to a re-embracing of the transdisciplinary and collaborative or co-production of knowledge approach. And of course, I'm put in mind that when I was first being trained in the 1970s in Adelaide and Canberra, the Annales School from France, from mid-century, 20th century, very emphasized social sciences but collaborative knowledge, that just history, just politics, just economics, just literature, just sociology is not enough. They're necessary but not sufficient. And so I embrace that too. I'm trained fundamentally as a historian, but I try to draw as much as I can from, and I hang out with colleagues in those other fields. The other is co-production of knowledge with our Chinese colleagues. So it's co-production of knowledge, if you like, across disciplines, but also across China and Western. And of course, with a number of China-born scholars, Chinese who are trained in the West and live and work in the West, as well as Chinese scholars who are born and raised in China, have done some study in the West and are back in China, and then Westerners who have spent considerable time in China. There's a wide range of ways to do this. And I just take 4 examples of collaborative projects that I think promise getting a better, more sound, and more three-dimensional view of China. The Maoist Legacy Project, run by Daniel Leze at Freiburg, brings together a wide range of scholars working on party history, and particularly that particular project was looking at the immediate post-Mao period and as you can see, the ping-pong, the transitional justice. On the right, Mao's Material Contradictions in Mao China, Jennifer Altahanger and Denise Ho, and a group working on wonderfully relooking from material history on the Communist Party, which I think is, and life in China, which is terribly important. Down and below, China Comics, Culture in People's Republic of China. Lena Henningsen at Heidelberg is leading a group working on popular and non-official writing, both in China. This one is on comics in the Cultural Revolution period, but she also had a project on Shouchaoban, the handwritten novels and things during the Cultural Revolution. But a wonderful application of literary studies to the understanding of Chinese Revolution, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And then revisiting the revolutions, the project I'm involved in currently, which is collaborative translations of PRC scholars working on party history. People like Li Lifang or Huang Daoxuan or Liu Yajuan Dong Limin and others, and we put together a Sinophone speaker and a Anglophone or Europhone speaker to translate these carefully, and then we have the chance to talk with the original author in China with good old Zoom, and that's. I know that there are many other projects that do similar things, but I keep telling my policy and government people, you got to work together. That's it for today. Let's see what you think. Steve, let's put us back onto a collaborative mode here.
Well, thank you very much, Timothy. It was a fantastic presentation. I think you have raised huge amount of very interesting issues that we can discuss. Before I kick off with a questions to you, let me just remind members of this webinar that you are welcome and indeed encouraged to raise questions or comments to Professor Cheek. If you disagree, please just do so very politely. And if you would like to stay anonymous, please say so, but nonetheless give me some background about who you are, which enable me to understand the questions better in terms of where it comes from. So before I hand it to anyone else, let me start off by asking you, Tim, about one of the first key lessons you highlighted for us. The issue about it is really fundamentally about ideology rather than managing interests, as it is normally the case when we deal with political parties in the West. Now, when we are in a stage of the party's development and history where the party and its supreme leader are very clear. Everything is led by the party on whatever subject, in wherever it happens to be, in whatever time frame it may be. Is the distinction between ideology, for which the sole interpreter is the party and its leader, any different from simply defending the interests of the party and its supreme leader? Is it a distinction with a difference or distinction without a difference?
Shall I answer?
Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, because I think you asked a question that's got to be on many people's minds. And when I talk about this kind of topic, I was in Taipei doing a close reading of Liu Shaoqi, and they looked at me and they go like, I can't believe it. They've convinced you. You've gone over. You've drunk the Kool-Aid. You actually believe this bullshit. And I think what I'm saying by focusing on ideology is that we need to have empathy, but not sympathy. That is to say, to understand why, and I'm speaking particularly of core party people, why they feel that having a values-based ideology that has to be promulgated and defended is so important. And my understanding is that they feel that this is the productive and practical way to do governance, 治理, right? 治国. But your point is, okay, yeah, you agree. They talk about and they emphasize correct thought and studying, whatever the wisdom of the party is. And they also claim that only the party has the correct thought. And is this just a way, is this a symptom of protecting the interests and power of the elite? Or is it something more? And what I would say is both, and that it is widely used now just to justify the party's power and to silence policy dissent or policy criticism. But it is like riding the tiger. It is it is Chinese society is always bigger. As Chairman Mao discovered in the Cultural Revolution, you set the Red Guards loose, you can't control everything they do. And so setting out the rubric that the correct thought of the revolution based on Mao, Deng, and Xi is the only way you can justify public policy. Well, it turns out, and this is an annoyance that Mao had, as you know, because the Cultural Revolution started by denouncing academic authorities, Chinese intellectuals are brilliant at reinterpreting whatever philosophy the government is putting out, right, to their own ends. And so there are arguments. These are arguments about China Dreams, about Tianxiazhui, and other things. So what I would say is that the ideological core of Chinese governance is like political culture itself, not a simple domain of hegemony, but a site of contestation.
Now, let me remind members of the webinar that if you would like to ask a question or raise a comment, please use the Q&A box. It's been unusually quiet in the Q&A box for the moment. So I will ask you a second question, Tim. You mentioned in your talk about Sun Yat-sen's political tutelage idea, the Shunzheng idea.
Right.
And you articulated the view that, in a sense, that's where it all started in terms of the idea of party states in China. So let's not forget where it came from. It came from the Kuomintang, from Sun Yat-sen, and not necessarily from the Bolsheviks.
Or not only.
Not only from the Bolsheviks. But I wanted to press you here because there is a basic difference, fundamental difference between the Sun Yat-sen idea of political tutelage and the Leninist idea of a party state, which is that the Sunist idea fundamentally is instrumental, and Shunzheng, political tutelage, is a stage to delivering full constitutional democracy. And it's not a kind of funny democracy. Sun never used any funny definition. He simply used democracy as democracy was being used. Might not have been very democratic in the context of the early 20th century by the standard of the 21st century, but the spirit of it was clearly normal democracy as it was being practiced in the rest of the world at the time. There is never such a commitment in the Leninist tradition of the idea of the party state. And it was never meant to deliver constitutional democracy. So it might be a bit rather sort of harsh to put it on Sun Yat-sen for being the origins of this wonderful or awful idea. What would you say?
I think you make a very important distinction. And though we can find structural and ideological or conceptual parallels between the Sun's Three People's Principles and what he set up in the 20s, and I remind readers to turn to John Fitzgerald, his 400-page study of Sun Yat-sen's political thought and implementation in the 1920s, and has been translated into Chinese as 环境中国. It is not the same as pure Leninism. Sun Yat-sen, we would say, would be, as you know, a cheap and cheerful amalgamation of Abraham Lincoln, Karl Marx, and Lenin, and Confucius, and from Marie Pasteur onward. Sun Yat-sen, by Western scholars, has not been highly valued as a coherent theorist, which is why I think that John Fitzgerald's book is so terribly important. I skipped things for time. The key step between Sun Yat-sen and the Communist Party is Chiang Kai-shek. the Kuomintang dictatorship in the 1940s. And it is, as you know, Liang Shoming, Hu Shi, and others said, hey, Xinjiang is only supposed to be 7 years. It's been much longer. Hello. And as you know, Chiang Kai-shek said, not yet. There may be an adjustment in the timeline. That said, if we look at what happened in Taiwan, later, the nature of the Leninist state or the Leninist style state run by the Kuomintang was never identical to the one run by the Communist Party. And if I want to be negative and really piss off Hans van der Ven, I'll say, my old classmate and friend, the only difference between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao was that Mao made the dictatorial state work better. But if you look at the ideology of Dai Jitao, it is not nearly, who was his theorist for Chiang Kai-shek, it was not nearly as coherent or as convincing as the Marxist-Leninism of the Communist Party, not just by Mao himself, but in the end they put it under the Mao brand. To see the similarities is, we want to be a little more nuanced. We're not saying that Sun Yat-sen created the dictatorship. It's saying that what he created as a temporary need to address a very real problem, which is there was not a workable government at the time. And there were lots of militarists around. And you can't just hold an election when you have political actors who go and shoot people, right? So the response to a violent social situation was this, Bolshevik style party that could draw some examples and language from the Bolsheviks model. Not to mention the silver that they were getting from the Soviet Union, because no one else would fund them at the time. You put us to a very fundamental question about the development of the Communist Party, and it's been said before, but it bears repeating and asking the people on the call today, how do you answer this question? We know that political parties of the Western liberal sort emerged in societies that had functioning governments. They were monarchies, right? Broadly. But their civil society was moderately developed and moderately stable. And the political parties developed. In China, for historical reasons, a very functional central government had been destroyed or had fallen apart by 1911. And so in that case, the party, the Dang, came before the state. So the short version is, in Europe and in North America, the parties came after the state. In China, modern history, the party came first, and this fundamentally shapes the nature of the party. And that's what I think what Sun Yat-sen was responding to. The trick of the matter is, it turns out that a Leninist Stalinist party was functional. It was able to reestablish a state under very difficult circumstances, but that it came with huge inbuilt problems.
Okay. First question I pick from the audience comes from Wyman Lam. Regarding the concept of Zhaohua, how has Marxist China, which emphasizes equality among individuals, justify this governance principle?
Good question. By meritocracy. The Confucian version of it is the superior, the Junzi, the person who has studied the Confucian classics and cultivated themselves. So merit and xiaoyang, cultivation. In the Communist Party, that merit and the cultivation is described beautifully and fundamentally by Liu Shaoqi in Lun Gongchang Dangyuan de Xiaoyang, right? The self-cultivation of the Communist Party member. And the but in the equality is that under Confucianism, and it was Donald Monroe, and I invoked his book, Concept of Man in Ancient China. I recommend it to you, and try to read him with some sympathy. By man, he meant men and women, but he was writing in the 1970s. The concept of the human in Confucian thought, he well pointed out, was evaluative equality, which is to say everybody can equally learn, but some achieve their learning. And those who achieve their learning are scholars. So who is the meritorious social political actor under communism? The Communist Party member who's gone through proper ideological training. So that's how they resolve. The Jiaohua has always assumed an equality of people, that all people can learn, but it operates through a hierarchy of achievement. And the criteria of achievement change by the particular political system that, whether it's Confucian or Kuomintang or communist.
Okay. Second question I pick comes from somebody who would like to say anonymous. It was mentioned earlier in the outward-facing lessons of history that the people are not ready to participate in politics. Do you think the Communist Party has a standard that people have to reach, or will they always stay in the same position of being unready?
That's a powerful question, and one that makes me sad. Because, as you know, if you read party doctrine on paper, it's wonderfully idealistic, right? It's about the liberation not only of the Chinese people, but of all working people. But if we read the administrative documents, they're pretty harsh. And then if we look at the history of the implementation, there's lots of trouble. Steve?
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm coming out of a period of health problems, and so hit me with the question again. The short version. It was about...
Yes, I have temporarily lost the list of questions that I had.
I didn't write down the note, and I should have.
Sorry. Because there are now quite a few questions. I'm trying to go back to the particular one.
Because it's a good question.
Yes, I think it was. Okay, yes. Will the people ever be ready?
Ever ready. Thank you. That's it. Okay. Ever ready. So the communist, the Marxist-Leninist approach is Communist Party. The term they use is 素质, right? The 素质. So 素质低, 素质不够. So the party view from Lenin all the way down is that proletarian consciousness has to be learned. It's on the basis of your relationship to the means of and mode of production, but people don't have it instantly. They have to learn it. And so there is the promise that the people will be ready. But the way that they show they're ready is they join the Communist Party, or basically show orthodox compliance, orthopraxy, right? And so the real difference there is being ready under the ideological governance system is when have you become a good party member or the equivalent. While we might in other societies think we are ready when you can be a responsible adult to vote in a system and express your interest. And your interest may be different from my interest, but it's resolved through the mechanisms of voting. In terms of Chinese intellectuals, and what we would call daily life China, I think there's plenty of people who are pretty tired of being told they're not ready. And I think that the historical experience of the Chinese people in the past 4 decades, certainly in my view, qualifies them to be ready to handle democratic governance. But it's up to them in their situation. It's not my call.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes also from somebody who stays anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please elaborate on your assertions about the roles, values, and interests played in leading Western and Chinese officials to talk past each other? Mm-hmm. It seems to me that Western engagement with China continues to refer to values, mostly what are called universal values, such as the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And at the same time, China's foreign policy is based on interests rather than any particular value. So is this a dialogue of the depth, or they just keep on talking past each other?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very acute and apt question, because you're absolutely right. Particularly in Canada, until recently, we had a values-based foreign policy, right? And the United States Congress, goes on and on about human rights, and that in China you do have in wolf warriors, and some of that semi-official foreign policy is very much interest-based. What I was referring, I think that's true, that both sides operate on both interests and values. But my point was to say, in terms of the etiquette and the required ritual expressions, when each side goes back to justify, so when the West justifies its values, it says it's because they're good and because it produces social justice and the best resolution of conflicting interests in society. And in the Chinese political discourse, yes, of course, a rational actor game theory approach can describe what's going on. The Communist Party wants access to materials, so the Chinese government wants access to materials, doesn't want to have tariffs up against it, and wants what it wants in the Nanyang in Taiwan. But it uses values language to explain it. I emphasize the ideology and the value side because I'm trying to explain to myself the time and effort the Communist Party spends on moral education. How much time and effort does the UK government or the United States government or the Canadian government spend on laying out correct thought and moral values for their domestic citizens? That's the key difference.
Next question is from a PhD student who is not at SOAS. Regarding the Haining New Era Civilization Practice Center that you have mentioned, this researchers' fieldwork shows that while local elites and retired cadres are highly engaged, the general public remains largely indifferent, and the execution by grassroots officials is often purely formalistic. How do you reconcile this discrepancy between the state's edification goals and the actual grassroots participation? Is this governance truly reaching its intended audience, or is it largely a performance for the local elites? Is it for real?
Yes, and I will preface my answer with a request, a plea to this person. Please send me your research. Hopefully you publish something, or when you're ready to publish something, send it to me at my email. You can find me on the web, because I think you have a very important insight. And this is the description that you summarized in your question of your research finding: elite engagement with these civilization practice centers and local interest, or just 表面上, 表态, to performative, is exactly what I discovered in the village covenants between the Song, Ming, and Qing period. And so the question I have is, why do they keep doing it? I'm keep saying, when clearly the local people don't really care about this stuff. And so part of it is you got to perform if that's what they want you to do. In that sense, living in China is like living in, it's like living in the Tesla Corporation or something. You have to talk the talk of the CEO in order to keep your job. So that's performative. But I think there's two things that are more, is why does the elite continue to emphasize this pedagogical state when it's clear that most people from the Song Dynasty forward just didn't care? This perdurance, this fixation of the elite. Why hasn't the government shifted to another way of doing things? And I don't have the answer, but I do have a track record that they've continued over time in the face of popular disinterest. So it's exactly what you're talking about. And so you're seeing an ongoing example of that. And maybe you have insights that I've missed, and I would love to learn from you. The final thing I would say is, from the very few, quote, ordinary Chinese I know, because I know mostly academics and some party people, but from family wise, there's profound cynicism, particularly about local governance. Scholars have already pointed out the difference between the Zhengfu and the Guojia, right? The Guojia is perfect. The Zhengfu is the local. They're a bunch of bandits. They people dislike their local government, but think the national government is or should be quite good. The performance of, even when people do this performatively or see it called on to be done in public, whether they do it or not, there's something about the ritual performance that the government ought to be talking about values and Chinese political theory and Chinese political social. Not that I'm going to be engaging in those values. It's like, I think of Catholic environment. I've worked with some colleagues in Latin America, and they said, wow, your China stuff really reminds us of Latin America, Catholic culture, where, of course, the Constitution should be perfect because the Virgin Mary is perfect. But none of the women I know are, men and women. In other words, their point being that there needs to be a perfect model, but actually life is quite separate from it. So I'm still wrestling with that, and it's part of why, it's the question I cannot answer, and I invite others to help, is why, when demonstratively, empirically, the general public does not much care for all this morality that's being peddled vigorously all the way down to the community level, county level, civilization practice centers. Why does the government keep doing it? They've been doing it since the Song Dynasty.
Thank you. Next questions, also from an anonymous PhD student. My question is that the CCP had its legacy from the Soviet Union and Marxist philosophy, which stresses evolutionary thoughts and one party as the leading player for leading a nation. But the contradiction is that how can a party stay unified and intact and always leading when it also emphasizes evolution inherently? Does this pose a contradiction to the Communist Party of China now? How might this contradiction lead the future of the party's leadership in terms of the citizens' conformity to the party's ideas?
So the tension between the party being always right and the party changing its policies. Would that be correct?
That inherently the party is always right as a monopoly of the truth, and yet the party says everything must change and evolve, and is based on Hegelian's dialectics, and therefore there can't be absolute truth.
Right. You got it right. There's only one in party ideology. There's only one absolute truth. The party is always right. And with the party says A this year and it says not A next year, that's okay. Or it can be okay if it is scientific. You know, I ended up editing and doing an introduction to the standard CCP biography of Mao Zedong by Pang Xianzhi and Jin Chongji that Cambridge translated. And so this is like, you know, those guys are in the BNEG. You know, these guys are in the Central Committee think tank. So it's very orthodox. And what struck me was it was better scholarship than I thought it would be. It's very much reform period orthodoxy, and that is it's the way they deal with Mao is they make him a figurehead, a glorious and, you know, wonderful and blah 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 blah, but the real thing is that the real core is the party, and that it's that biography of Mao is really tracking Central Committee resolution to Central Committee resolution. They praise Mao because they thought he led they claim he led the Central Committee well. In Marxism-Leninism, the social science, the scientific approach to governance is Central Committee resolutions. Right? That's the legislature. And so that's in their own ideology, how they balance being always right and always changing. Because as material conditions change, the Central Committee considers again. The Central Committee is science in Marxism-Leninism. It's not for me, but it is for Marxism-Leninism, right? And so when we say we have a scientific theory about the nature of the atom, it's changed over time. You know, now we're down to quarks and quarks. And you know, the physics as of the late 19th century hated, you know, 10 years later, they hated what Einstein had to say, but we changed. So is science not good? No, science is good. Has science changed the answers that it gave us about things? Yes. And it's because we believe in the scientific method. So that is the fundamental metaphor that those of us outside China kind of think of it as a joke, saying, oh, you know, the science of Marxism. Yeah, right. But for people in it, they do. They think it's a science. So that's my understanding. I agree with you that it amazes me that people don't give up on the Communist Party. Could you imagine the flip-flops that the Communist Party has done from a Western political party? You know, they would be voted out of office in a minute.
Next question is a very simple factual question that somebody would like you to remind them. The two book titles you flagged up at the very beginning, that's Mark Sheldon's book and Mary Goldman's book.
Yeah.
If you could read the title out again slowly so that people can take notes.
Sure. So Mark Selden, S-E-L-D-E-N, The Yan'an Way. The original edition in the 1970s was in the Old Pinyin, Y-E-N-A-N. But he did a second edition in the 90s on M.E. Sharp called Revolutionary something in China, Revisiting the Yan'an Way. And that time he did it as Y-A-N-A-N, Yan'an. So Mark Selden, Yan'an Way. And then Merle Goldman, it's Harvard University Press, 1967, A Literary Dissent in Communist China.
Okay, thank you. Next question is about the slide you had on diversity of the party, in which you mentioned you flag up Zhao Ziyang as the symbol of pragmatism. Mm-hmm. The question is, why Zhao Ziyang? Why not Deng Xiaoping or Hu Yaobang? Are they all the same and you just happen to flag up Zhao Ziyang, or there's a reason why you picked Zhao Ziyang?
They, you should always be careful with intellectuals and particularly scholars. Why do you think there's that image of the Communist Party 10 Lives book in the back? It's the chapter by by Klaus Mühlhahn. Klaus wrote about Zhao Ziyang in the 10 Lives book. And so that was one that I, was particularly convinced by his approach. Your question is totally right. Between Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, and Jiang Zemin, I think you could look at that cluster, because they all come with various forms of what I was calling reform communism. And of course, they're different. Zhao Ziyang was more conservative than Hu Yaobang, most of us thought, looking in the 1980s. Then Deng Xiaoping is complicated, right? Because, Deng Xiaoping made it possible to be pragmatic. He was very pragmatic. But his pragmatism included sending the tanks into Tiananmen Square to shoot the students. Not that, I'm summarizing, to send the military forces to repress. So he was, he's a militant communist, just like Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai did lots of wonderful things, we think, but he also ran the secret police and killed people, particularly in the first half of his career. So these are violent revolutionaries coming out of a violent environment where all the nice people were dead or gone overseas or shut up. So yes, Zhao Ziyang is just an example. It could be others.
One more question. You asked at the beginning of your lecture as to what would be a good concept to describe Dang in China.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a suggestion from one.
Yay.
Would the term order, as in Masonic order, a possible terms to better understand the Chinese concept of Dang?
Thank you. That's very suggestive. Of course, rather ominously, it reminds me of the term used by Pol Pot in Cambodia for the party, which I believe translates into English as the organization. But order is maybe, it has a more kind of abstract or broader one, order. Because it did bring order. The point I was making that in most of the Europe and North America, there was a state and then there were parties. But because of the particularities of modern Chinese history and imperialism and the fall of the Qing, the formation of the radical parties, first the Kuomintang and then the CCP, was you had the party first and the state second. And so order really, that's right. What was put on that political organization was a historical task that was not put on political parties in Europe or North America, right? Those parties, Liberal Party, Labor Party, Republican Party, Democratic Party, Whigs, whatever else, Federalists, they didn't have to create a state. There was a state system. But there was a functioning state system. They just wanted to run it. So thank you for that. I like that. Dang as an order. I look forward to hearing and reading other people's answers to these questions. Thank you for your time.
Just to reassure you and all participants that we will be saving all the questions and comments, and they will all be sent on to Professor Cheek in due course. We don't about 5 minutes left in the meeting. Let me read out a very long comment from Professor Stephen Morgan. In recent years, I have been going backward in time to the Song dynasty, moving away from the present and also turns to Southeast Asia. This includes reading the Ming Xi Lu, the Ming Dynasty Chronicles. What strikes me about Xi Jinping is how deeply intertwined his thought is with long-held imperial views of the world and China's role, the civilizing mission, the moral imperative of benevolent guidance, permeates the main policies of the Yongli Emperor in launching the great voyages to the Western Sea, or indeed the Indian Ocean in today's terms. He cites an example from the Mingxilu, which is dated the 9th of May 1407. Gao Ming, Lu Sha, and others who had been sent by their rulers, including Nan Lo Da, the native officials of Ava Burma, came to the court and offered tribute of local produce in a mission of guilt. Previously, the Mingyang Pacification Superintendent had engaged in feuding and killing with Jia Li Nan Lu Da. Nan Lu Da had then taken advantage of the trouble to dispatch troops to attack Mengyang, killing Dao Mu Dan and his eldest son, Xi Lun Hua, carrying off their people, cattle, and horses, and then occupying their territory. When these events became known, the messenger, Zhang Hong, and others were commanded to proceed there with imperial orders of instruction castigating him. Nan Lu Da and so on were frightened and subsequently returned the territory and the people and property which they had carried off. Then they sent a person to the court with their admission of guilt. The emperor instructed the officials of the Ministry of Rice, saying, quote, "The men and the Yi have admitted guilt. They are not to be punished. Give all of them verification tallies and instruct them to come to offer tribute once every 3 years." End of quote. He said many such accounts exist where extortion fails to curtail behavior. Violence was delivered firmly. I thought it was a interesting comment from history. I don't know whether you want to respond to that or not.
I just, Stephen Morgan, I want to thank him, and I sense the deep influence of Chinese studies at the Australian National University. And as I had a quick look, and I think you're a PhD from ANU, and I think it's a wonderful quote, and it has all of the contradictions and problems we face today. It's like, what's pure power? What's keeping the government? But why all this moral language? And what does it mean that they talk about this? And do they believe it? And if they don't believe it, what does it mean? And that it's been going on. You'll be interested in this volume when we finally get it out on the Chinese statecraft from early Ming to Xi Jinping. And I'll be grateful for your views on it. There's some very fine essays by various colleagues in that. And it's you know that Vivian Hsu at Oxford, retired, has been thinking very carefully about resonances between traditional Chinese statecraft and modern, along with Patricia Thornton as well. And so those are speakers, Steve, you should get.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Tim, Professor Cheek, for this very interesting and thoughtful webinar. And thank you also to those of you who have participated, and particularly those of you who have shared your thoughts and questions. I'm afraid it's my painful duty to have to draw these webinars to a close, and being an online event, we are pretty brutal about it. So thank you, and I hope to see you at the next online events that the SOAS China Institute hosts. Thank you and goodbye.